Welcome to SPL Mixing. My name is Daniel Jason Booth and I'm a professional audio mixing engineer. In today's video, you'll learn the key to understanding compression. We'll look at how to achieve musical compression using just about any downward style compressor. And we'll briefly cover what each parameter does without getting too technical. And we'll also look at a few different compressor layouts. But you're going to want to make sure that you stick around to the end of the video because the last part I show you ties everything together that I talk about in the first part. Be sure to hit that like button and consider subscribing for future content. Remember to turn on all notifications. Let's get into it. Most professionals, they don't look at the compression settings that they're using so long as it sounds good and gets them to where they want. Today I'm going to take a similar approach. I'm just going to tell you what to look for so that you understand how what you're doing affects the end result. Pretend for a moment that this is our music. So what we have is a soft moment, a loud moment, and then a soft moment again. And then we decide to apply compression. What happens? Well, as we can see here, we've lost some of the level because the compressor saw this and then it kicked in and then it turned it down smoothly. And then as soon as it wasn't loud anymore, it began to release it because it was quiet again. So if I just take that out again, you can see that there's quite a difference between those two. What happens if I make the attack really fast? You can see now that we've lost that nice, smooth, gradual curve in, and we've lost a little bit of the initial leading edge of the sound. Let me just show you that again. So this is with a slow attack. You can see that it lets a little bit of that level, that original level through. This is usually enough time to allow that unpitched part of the instrument through, because a lot of instruments, they have a transient and then they have a tonal part, which is the sustained portion of the sound. So it has a tone, the initial part doesn't. Let me put it in musical terms. So a snare drum will have, for example, an initial hit and then maybe the drum rings. That's a tonal aspect of that. A kick drum might have the snap of the beater, then it might have the boom that follows that. The plectrum on a guitar string before you actually hear the note. So it's really worth understanding how this attack changes the characteristic of the sound. Likewise, the release. What happens if we decide to make it longer? Well, it actually turned the whole sound down if you have a look. It never completely released. So we lost a little bit of level overall because in between the soft section, the loud section, and then the soft section again, we just didn't quite get there. The release was too long compared to the 0.05 versus the 3 seconds. We actually lose a little bit of level. But that's why we have makeup gain, because if we lose level, we can always add it back to try and get roughly what we had. And the best way to level match is to just do it by ear. You can see the release characteristic here. Let me turn up the output of the compressor. You can see that it has a curve to it, and that curve will change, obviously based on how long that release is. What happens if we turn up the ratio? So by turning up the ratio from 1.5 to 2, we've actually made the compressor go even deeper into the sound. What if we go a bit further? This is affecting how deep the compressor goes. There's some things to notice. Having a good visual understanding, or at least being able to visualize what's happening when you have a slow attack versus a fast attack, and also how deep you go, how much makeup gain you add. All these things matter, okay? Because we can manipulate the envelope of the original sound. We have to try to adapt the way that the compressor reacts. That is the attack, the release, how deep the compression is, and the threshold. We have to adapt that to the material. So now that you've got a little bit of a visual of what's happening, let's put some of this into practice. So we've got a bass guitar. Now I'm going to set this in a way where we can basically have it grab everything with our fast attack. I'm going to have it release quite quickly so that it releases in between our musical events. If we were doing it on a kick drum, we'd want it to release in the space here before it gets to this here. In the bass, I'm not so much concerned with that. In actual fact, I feel like These are phrases where I don't mind if the compression is a little bit pinned, but I want it to release here. So let's maybe just loop this bit and see if we can get it to release before it comes back to here. So what we'll do, we've got the ratio to stun, we've got the release to the fastest, and then we're going to put the threshold all the way down. And let's just see if we can get it to release before it comes back to here. So what is this telling us? The compression is quite deep, and that might be a combination of the threshold and the ratio. I'm going to adjust the threshold because we know that the compressor is basically maxed out on the ratio. What we could do is we could set how much of the signal it's reacting to. Now, a good rule of thumb is based on the gain reduction meters. If we have a look, if we play it again, watch the gain reduction meters, and what this will show you is how deep the compression is. But what I want you to look for is there should be a point where it's trying to return to, and it might be somewhere around here, but we want to move that point over to 0. The reason why we want to do that is because we want it to return to an uncompressed state so that it's not always compressing, because otherwise we might as well just turn down the output of the compressor and just be done with it. So we want to find that sweet spot where we can get the compressor compressing, and then as soon as it's got time to release, we want it to release completely before the next phrase, okay? So let's give that a go. So I'm going to adjust this threshold and watch how this reacts. And just so you're aware, I want it to release in this section here. I don't mind if it's compressing through here. I think that's not bad there. Let's try it on a bigger section. If we had the release too long, say 3 seconds, this is a weird compressor actually because it's got 2 different releases. It's got the shorter releases here, and then it's got the release values so you can have like in between these settings. Anywho, 3-second release time, which is quite long, what we'll see is that it actually ends up getting back to that point where it's not releasing in time. You can see it's just hovering around this section here. So that tells me that that release is far too long. Let's switch back over to this one and try 2 seconds. Still taking too long. Let's go to 1 second. So the gain reduction is about 1.5. It's still not there yet, so let's turn it down again. I think 0.2 is probably going to be it. Cool. Now let's adjust the attack. Every time the compressor sees one of these notes, it's reacting quite quickly, as we can see with the needle. So what we can do is we can open up that attack if we like and see if we want to let through some of that transient. I might take a little bit of that transient off, so let's get it on to 0.3, I reckon. So it's not quite as quick as it was. It's not as slow as the slowest setting. I feel like that's a little bit too slow to react. Now we are just looking at this from a visual standpoint. I'll remind you that we are making music. So once we've dialed this in, we'll start to reduce the ratio, and that will reduce the amount of depth of that compression. And we can basically decide from there whether we like it or have less of it. it's letting through a bit of that transient part of the sound from the bass. There's a few percussive moments in that bass, which I want to maybe bring out a little bit more. And the way to do that is just let the compressor not compress those. By having that attack be a little bit slower, we are missing some of the sustain. So what we could do is we could balance that relationship between the amount of attack that's getting through and the amount of sustain basically is determined by the ratio. So let's have a play with that. So no compression there. Let's do a level match. So I'm pretty happy with that. We've got a slowish attack, so we're letting through a little bit of that percussive nature of the bass. The release is releasing in between the musical moments. Let's have a look again. In fact, we could even try making that a little bit slower. I think we're losing a little bit of level there because this isn't quite releasing everything just in time. So what we could do is we could go in and manually make up some of that. So how do I look at this stuff? Well, the ratio is really just how much do I want it to compress. The threshold is how much of the signal do I want this compressor to look at. You've got to imagine that the threshold is a line. So let's go to rectify. And this is probably more how a compressor sees it. When we're lowering the threshold, we're starting at the very top level and then we're bringing that down. And what we're doing is we're saying, hey, ignore all this stuff underneath. So anything that goes over that, then tell these other people to do their job. Now, how do we apply that in this scenario? I've decided that I want it to enhance the attack. And as we know, when we have the attack open and we compress fairly hard, we create this disparity between the level of the transient that gets through and the sustained portion of the sound that comes after that. And so in effect, when we add a bit of makeup gain, we can enhance that transient. If we wanted to enhance that transient even more, what we could do is we could up the compression and we could open the attack so that it's a slower attack. And we would have to play with the threshold and the release just to see where we're sitting in terms of, is it releasing in time? So let's have a look. What if we decide, you know what, let's actually dig in really hard. So we'll take it even deeper into the sound, and that might actually enhance that transient even further. But we're not releasing fast enough now, so let's go back to the fastest release. Now what we could do here is we could compare the in and the out. So this is what's coming out to what's coming in. So we seem to have more level coming in, so we're going to raise it a bit more. We're actually losing level because it isn't quite releasing fast enough. We do at this point have a bit more of that transient coming through. The compression is kicking in harder. It's reacting to more of the signal. We've gone past the natural envelope of the sound because we're not releasing in time and we're losing level. So let's just solo it for a second and just hear what it sounds like on its own. And now with compression. Can you hear the beginnings of the notes? Can you hear the fingers on the strings a bit more? Have a listen again. You can't really hear it as much there as when you do this. Especially in the section here. Let's just isolate this bit here. So now we've got a little bit more depth in how he's playing that part. It feels like he's digging in a bit more, and I suspect too that overall the level of the bass is a lot smoother because we've dug in fairly deep. Now let's try a different compressor. Let's try an 1176. Now an 1176 reacts quite differently. It's got an input and an output. It has an attack and a release. It has fixed ratios. We don't have the option of having in between 4 and 8 or 8 and 12. We've just got these different buttons. The release is marked in such a way that the 7 is actually the fastest of the settings. The higher the number, the faster the release, or the faster the attack time. And you can see here, we've got a 4:1 ratio. So that means that from the quietest all the way up to the loudest sound, here's its journey. Essentially, when it gets to that certain point, it starts to turn it down and it can't go anywhere past that point. So if we change to 8:1, we see that the threshold changes. And it gets higher as we go up. If I turn the input up, it should raise this level here coming in, but this threshold should extend further down. You watch. So with this compressor, we can see that it has quite a fast attack, and even the slowest attack setting is quite quick. What about the release time? If we go to the fastest release, that actually affected the curve of the attack. That's interesting. Let's go to the bluey. From here, we've got the slowest attack, and if we make it faster, we can see how fast it is. Okay, same with the release. If we make it too long of a release, it turns the entire signal down because it doesn't have time to release, just like we saw on the other compressor. So we know that if you want to enhance that transient, we can drive that compressor quite hard. We can turn down the output or the gain and have more of a spiky signal compared to what we started off with. So with this compressor, let's go to the blue version. Common to all compressors is this gain reduction meter. So we can watch this and we can determine how much level to drive in. Because this has a fixed threshold, we can't change the threshold, but what we can do is we drive the level up to that threshold to get it to start compressing. So let's do that. I'm just going to solo it for the moment. So our threshold starts about there. So let's continue driving it up. And what we'll do is, like we did before, we'll have the fastest attack, the fastest release. Now, one thing I should note is that because we're driving this in, we need to adjust this at some point because we're driving more signal in and it's going to overshoot and it's going to start clipping. So we need to keep an eye on this. Before I start playing with the attack and the release, we're actually a bit loud, so I'm going to just turn that down. Now let's open the attack way up. Maybe we go to something like this. No, I think probably somewhere there. What I'm listening for is the beginnings of those notes. But I'm not getting enough of those, so I'm going to drive harder into that compressor and it will create more of a disparity between the transient part of the sound and the sustain part. So now I'm getting the sound that I want, but it's not quite releasing completely, and I'm on the fastest release. So I could take this level back down, but I actually like the sound of it. So I'm going to keep it the way it is. you can hear that we're getting to a point where we're digging up a lot of that string noises and stuff like that that we maybe wouldn't want to hear. Let's put it back in context. I don't actually like what that's bringing up, so I might just not dig in so hard. I think that's better, but I preferred this. Now, what else can we look at? We can look at the stock standard compressor, and let's set it up really quickly. Now that we kind of know what we're doing, we'll go fast release, fast attack, ratio to full, and we'll lower this down. Can you hear that? Because we've got such a fast release, it's cutting through the waveform, and that's giving us the distortion. Have a listen in solo. Now that might be something that you like. We could even adjust what the compressor hears or reacts to by filtering out some of that low end. If you like a little bit of that grit, you can keep it in. I'm not a huge fan of the distorted tone. It's just good to know that that's an option. And the reason why it's getting so much distortion out of it is because it's very, very, very quickly releasing through what are fairly long waveforms. So it's ripping through it. And we're hearing that as a bit of a growl and a bit of distortion. But really what's happening is the compressor is just chopping the level down and up in such a way that it's almost creating another tone on top of that lower frequency, trying to superimpose a higher frequency over a lower frequency. And that's what causes that distortion. I'm going to keep that API option, and we'll now have a look at putting some compression on the saxophone. Let's go with a DBX 160. Now we've got a threshold, we've got ratio, but it's called compression. We've got an output gain. An output gain, as we know, is literally just level that we make up after the plugin's done its thing. We've got a gain reduction meter, something that we see on every plugin. Let me show you a different one. Let me show you a digital plugin. So our compressor, the gain reduction meter is actually built into here. So even if you can't hear compression, you can at least have a look at what that meter is telling you and kind of make adjustments based on what you already know about attack and release. I feel like the saxophone in this case might actually be a little bit too peaky. And so what we can do is we can run a fast attack and we can get that to kick in a bit sooner. We'll run a fast release, pull the threshold down, that down. Let's adjust the threshold like we did before. We'll adjust it so that we're getting the sound to release completely. We're getting very deep compression. What we'll do is we'll let a little bit of that transient through if we like. So in this case, we've got quite a long attack available to us. If we have it open too long, it might actually be that it lets all of the sound through because this is a short, stabby part. So the compression might actually just kick in after it's already passed through the compressor. It is missing most of it. We're just hearing a little bit of that leading edge of every note coming through. I'm happy to leave it there and maybe just play with the release. See if we can get it to slow down a little bit. And for the same reason that we don't have a fast release like we did on the bass with this particular compressor, we don't want to superimpose a distortion over that. Now that we've got it to the point where it's kind of grabbing the signal that we want, and we've got enough of the attack of the sound coming through, and it's releasing fairly musically, we can adjust the depth of that compression. How does that compare to the original level? So we're actually losing level. So what we can do is we can either quicken up the release, which I don't really want to do, or we can start pumping up some of the output. So what I'm hearing is more thickness, more consistency to the sound. Musically speaking, that release could probably come a bit sooner, which means that we're going to have to drop our output gain. You can hear we've got more of the tone of the instrument because we're only letting a little bit of that transient portion of the sound through. We could even possibly take a bit more of it off. Hear how it sounds a bit more contained as opposed to when we open up the attack. Really contained. If you don't like the depth of that compression, you can take that down a little bit more. Let's have a look at this DBX. I just wanted to show it to you because it's a unique compressor. You don't have a lot of control, you just have a compression ratio and a threshold. And so really what we're adjusting is how much of the signal is below or above that threshold. So maybe we turn this up all the way. So we're not getting anything above that threshold, so it's not going to induce any compression. So let's go the other way. Now we're really compressing it. But what we can do is we can look at the dance between these two. That to me is getting it in a place where it's a good balance between compressing the peaks and leaving some of that sustained portion of the sound in there. So let's now determine how deep we want that compression to be. Now, it's not releasing in time, so as we've done before, we can raise this a little bit. Now, what I'm hearing is that it's gone from this quite forward sound to something that's sitting a little bit further in the background, and it's just sitting nicely in the track, and it's a nice consistent level. Maybe we will raise this threshold a little bit more. So to me, that's too far. So somewhere around there is pretty good. We're getting a good amount of release in between. That's compression. And for the most part, when you're going for musical settings, what you really need to focus on is what's the sound that I'm compressing, going with a goal of what it is that you want to achieve, label what it is that you're trying to compress, determine what it is that you like about it, and what it is that you think that could be better. And you have these options to manipulate the time of the attack and the release and adjust the depth of that compression. Let's get to the real key to compression. When I'm adjusting compression, I'm going for a sound, I'm assessing what the sound is, and then in the context of the mix, I'm going to change that sound to something that fits better within the overall balance. It doesn't matter what it sounds like in solo. You've got to do it in context. The reason why you've got to do it in context is because you're adjusting something that is adjusting the level. So looking at it overall, you now should understand how the attack and the release controls affect the sound. And you can play with that attack and that release time and essentially, work it to the point where you get the sound that you want. But work it in context, have a plan, have an idea of what you want to do with the sound. There's so many different options with compressors. Now, if you do have any questions, let me know in the comments below. If you're really struggling with this stuff on your own productions, send me an email at daniel@splmixing.com and we can talk about getting your project mixed. Thanks for watching and happy mixing.